Is it always right to bolt the bird? Over the last couple of weeks, we looked at chess openings and how they might provide information in Magic openings to lead you best into the mid game. Specifically, last week, we looked at theory openings and how you need to rely on good game principles when making these decisions because you can't always rely on the perfect setup. Today, we're going to review 5 of my favorite Magic isms or idioms that give insight into these good game principles. Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back. I'm Supreme Verdicts, a practicing attorney by day and a Magic strategist by night. After a long day of working on the rule of law, I come home to master the laws of Magic. 5. Always bolt the bird. This archetypal situation is seen when your opponent plays an early mana dork, traditionally a Birds of Paradise, although any mana dork might work. And then, traditionally, you have removal in your hands, oftentimes a lightning bolt. Do you kill their mana dork immediately? Do you wait to see what they cast and then try to use your removal on that? It depends on the context. A familiar answer to a lot of these principles, and hence why they inform our theory openings to begin with. In a general game, the player who spends the most amount of mana will have the greatest advantage. When a player ramps out early, especially if they're going first, they can gain both a mana advantage and a tempo advantage, leaving you far behind in the dust. In these situations, it's relevant to trade down on resources, to use your removal spell to get rid of their early card, effectively a 1-for-1 on card and almost a 1-for-1 on mana, in order to trade down resources to make sure that they can't get ahead before you have a chance to solidify your game state. But is it always correct? In fact, it isn't. It's always contextual. But it is generally correct to slow down your opponent's game plan. There are, however, other situations that might add a twist to how you want to approach this. For example, if your removal spell isn't as restrictive as, say, a lightning bolt, let's call it Bitter Triumph, you might be best waiting to see what big creature they ramp into in order to kill it. But that requires a couple of assumptions. It requires them to be ramping into a creature, specifically, that creature then being killable, and for that creature to not provide value, at least enough value to offset its cost when it enters the battlefield. In multiplayer, the whole dynamic changes. In fact, Bolt the Bird does not become a generally acceptable thing. In fact, it's almost rarely correct. When you're using one of your resources, a full card and some amount of mana, either on your turn or another, you had to hold up that mana regardless, you're often using one of your resources, or card and mana, 2 technically, depending on how you look at it, to remove another one of your opponent's resources, their mana dork. This leaves both you and opponent 1 down a card and that amount of mana. It leaves opponents 2 and opponent 3 without having needed to trade any amount of resources whatsoever. They got to sit by and watch you and opponent 1 duke it out. Next thing they know, they haven't used any other resources, and in fact, in terms of comparative resources, they're actually up in this exchange, because not only are you weaker by having used that lightning bolt on a different creature, by having used your lightning bolt, but also you've removed a Birds of Paradise, neither of which was theirs. Comment down below if you disagree. Let me know if you think that it's right to bolt the bird in a game of Commander. Then make sure you like and subscribe. But the last reason that you might want to hesitate before you always bolt the bird is a term called bolt bait. And this is a concept we'll see come up again and again in a Magic the Gathering game, because we're not just playing cardboard against cardboard with some AI or a robotic player. It's not a video game at the end of the day. You're playing against another player. There is an element of poker to this, an element of bluffing. There's always a chance that your opponent either knows to a degree what you're doing or recognizes that bolt the bird is a very common saying. And in that sense, they might play something in the hopes that you'll remove it, because that leaves you down a resource and they can throw away a resource that they either don't care about or that isn't as important to their game plan in order to clear the way of your removal for one of their larger threats later on. This will most often come up when your opponent is aware of what kind of deck you're playing and if it's removal heavy or not, and that way they can try to bait out some of your interaction and land a value creature. Number 4, always go face. Face is the place. We're going to be looking at this mono red deck in just a moment, but for this next Magic ism, The idea is that burn spells or creatures attacking should always be hitting your opponent, focusing in on that life total. This magic-ism comes from the idea that you should be focusing on one particular resource in this resource management game. Yes, you can play a bunch of burn spells and a bunch of discard spells. You're attacking the cards in your hand, you're hitting their life total, but this becomes less powerful as by doing both, you're taking away from one and the other. Here, by focusing exclusively on lifestyle in a mono-red burn kind of deck or strategy, you can make sure that you are actively killing your opponent and progressing your game plan as fast as possible. Your opponent's board, as they build it out, doesn't matter nearly as much if they're already dead. This is about executing your plan and giving reach to those decks that really need to cross the finish line, such as an aggressive deck like mono red. As I mentioned, this concept also works when you're deciding whether or not to attack planeswalkers. You can send your creatures at your opponent's planeswalkers to pick them off, but if your opponent is at a low life total, it is almost certainly going to be more worth it to close the game out as fast as possible if you can win in this particular race. We're going to take a look at this deck right in front of me. Oh, excuse me. Where we see mono red aggro submitted by Adam Bruni, which got 10th place last weekend at the SCG Con Baltimore for Magic Spotlight for Spider-Man. Here you can see this is a creature-based red aggro deck, so it is not nearly as all into the burn strategy as certain other burn decks might be. However, in the spells, we get a little bit more information about how the game looks to be closed out. So in creatures, we see Burnout Bastronaut, Hired Claw, Emberheart Challenger, Razorkin Needlehead, Screaming Nemesis, Nova Hellkite. Almost all of these creatures, specifically Hired Claw, Razorkin Needlehead, Screaming Nemesis, have some way to deal damage directly to their opponent, albeit to a creature potentially as well, in the case of Screaming Nemesis. Nova Hellkite offers a way to pick off their opponent's creatures, and Burnout Bastronaut gives that form of evasion that can be pumped, probably in order to hit the opponent harder rather than get blocked and then pump up. In addition, in the spells, while we do see one Obliterating Bolt, which can only attack a creature or a planeswalker, and 3 Witchstalker Frenzies, which only hit creatures, we then see 8, so double the amount of the creature-only targeting spells and planeswalker. We see 4 Burst Lightnings and 4 Lightning Strikes. These spells can hit creatures. They can clear the way. If the opponent puts up some kind of blocker, you can use this to clear the way to get in, and that is often the correct move in the early game. For example, if you're trying to bolt the bird and get the blocker out of the way so you can then continuously be dealing damage. But towards the late game, and even in the mid game for a fast, aggressive strategy such as mono red aggro, it's often correct to, instead of use your Burst Lightning to just deal 2 damage to one of their creatures to get out a blocker, you might want to save it and pay 5 in order to hit the player directly. Now again, this all depends on context, and context is often what can change the math in this equation. Faces the Place is true in a lot of ways. It's about focusing on one particular resource and doing everything you can to run your opponent out of that resource so you can win the game in the long run. However, there is the nuance to it. Sometimes it's right to get rid of a blocker on the way, as we can see the way this mono-red burn deck, not exactly burn deck, but this mono-red aggro deck is built. It has a lot of creatures. It's likely picking off blockers, and closer to the mid-game and late game, is it finishing the job with the burn spells. So what do we do here? We have 2 competing game principles that we've now talked about. On the one hand, always bolt the bird, but on the other hand, face is the place when it comes to pointing your burn spells. So here you are with your opponent casting a Birds of Paradise. You have a Lightning Bolt in hand. Which principle wins out? If you answered, it depends, you're absolutely right. It is all contextual. That's always the correct answer. If this is turn 1 and your opponent's playing the Birds of Paradise, maybe it's right to kill it with a burn spell so you can get in an attack later on. But if you've already put in the work and your opponent's down to 3 life, killing the Birds of Paradise doesn't matter when you can just end the game right then and there. 3. Life is a resource. After all, the only life point that matters is the last one. Winning at 1 life does not confer any benefit or advantage than winning at 69 life, besides the lulls, of course. There are so many cards out there that allow you to directly translate your life into other resources, whether it be cards, creatures, or other advantages to your board states. However, life can also be used to buy you things such as time and tempo, these intangible resources that are part of the game. And by virtue of being able to draw one card each turn, cards in a way, in a more natural way at least. An example of this is to use your life as a way to gain a virtual form of card advantage, not directly paying life or giving life to draw cards, as we see in so many incredible black cards. But no, I mean literally you're in a situation where your opponent is playing an aggressive creature that you can remove. You have the removal spell in hand and you see their aggressive creature across from you. But instead, you opt to wait. You take the damage. You are trading your life. This creature, you are allowing it to attack you and take you down in your life resource for time. Your opponent, you pass the turn. You don't cast your removal spell. Your opponent plays a second creature and attacks you again. This time you're losing more life. You could cast this removal spell at any point and not take the damage, but you're choosing to let it hit you before you untap and wipe the board. You get to hold that removal spell now continuously for the next creature your opponent's casting, but you spent one card now, a board wipe, in order to clear the 2 cards that your opponent has cast. You get to keep your removal spell and effectively trade it in 1 card for 2 cards, with the only cost being a few life points. This is how life can buy you a little bit of time, as well as the various other aspects of trading it for resources. This is also important to remember in the context of the 4th principle that I mentioned before, which is always go face, and face is the place. In a lot of situations, your life, you can take the damage, and you can take the burn spells to your face, understanding that if you can gain the advantage in other resources, such as cards, such as board state, eventually you can overtake, even if you're only at 1 life. 2, just run more removal. Is this a good Magic principle or saying? Well, as with the last few, it depends. It's entirely contextual. Are you playing in Standard, 1 versus 1, or are you playing Commander in a multiplayer game? If you're trying to advocate to have more single target removal in a multiplayer game, I hate to break it to you, but that's probably breaking good principles. Similar to the Bolt the Bird discussion previously, if I'm spending 1 card to remove 1 thing from my opponent, I have 2 other opponents who are winning in that particular exchange. They use 0 resources in exchange for -2 resources from their opponents. Another place that this comes in, though, if let's say we are playing 1v1, does this fit in your game plan? After all, does having more removal benefit you in some way? Do you get things when creatures die? Do you want more instants and sorceries in your graveyard? Is the removal that you're adding to your deck stapled to other cards that benefit your game plan? Or maybe you have inevitability, a concept where the longer the game goes, the stronger your deck is positioned to win. In general, adding more removal, I think, is more of a bad thing. From this particular perspective, high resource games and low resource games, enigmatic by 2 particular cards. And there is another article out there somewhere of this. There's a few articles that touch on these principles. I highly recommend you look them up if you're interested, or let me know if you want me to do a deeper dive. But does your deck and the play style that you prefer match each of these styles of gameplay? For example, in a high resource game, rather than having more removal in your deck, you're actively adding to the board. Every card you do benefits you in some way by increasing your resources. In a low resource game, you are actively taking away from the board. Every resource you are spending is removing resources from your opponent. Oftentimes, your deck can be built in such a way to take advantage of things like the graveyard, or of discarding, or of creatures dying. That way, when your opponent loses resources, you gain a marginal benefit that, in the long term, you can use to win. However, there is a distinct falsehood to a low resource strategy in that your opponent top decks the perfect answer or a strong threat at the wrong moment where you don't have the removal piece you need, they're going to take over the game. And it's not a matter of if you had enough removal, it's a matter of you used your removal. There's only so many things you can cast your removal spells on. A deck that has all removal spells will not win against the deck that has no removal spells. Because at a certain point, the only way to win is either by decking them out or with a creature with getting your life total down to 0. There's, of course, exceptions to this, turbo fog decks and the like that recur your deck entirely so you can remove all their things and wait for them to deck out. But again, it's all contextual based on what you have. Instead, you can play a high resource game rather than add additional removal to your deck. That way, rather than you only have to then get rid of their particular threats or the things that threaten you directly. As opposed to needing to constantly answer their board, you make your opponent answer you. For this particular example, we're going to look at my Kaikar Wind's Fury deck. This is a deck I particularly like. I call it Bird Law. I'm an attorney. I know, it's adorable. Think I might take it apart soon, which is really sad, but I really like the new Sokka Tenacious Tactician card. And it's effectively the same thing, but more aggressive, which almost makes it a little bit more fun in a way. My Kaikar is often built as a kind of creature control deck, non-creature control deck, but that makes creatures and spirits when you cast those. So you have the blockers when you need them, you have the attackers when you need them, you can get a little mana ramp if you need it, and will often just kind of sit back and control the board. I went with a little bit of a different direction with Kaikar, where I think of Kaikar as an engine in my deck, and I utilize the white in its mana ability to constantly be drawing cards from my little creatures entering, such as with Idol of Oblivion, Irreverent Gremlin, I know it's not white, but Welcoming Vampire, Takesia's Welcome, Enduring Innocence. I use the red to kind of burn my opponents whenever those creatures enter, and a few other ways, and blue as kind of just a protection suite, making sure that I have counter spells when I need to protect my board. The idea being that rather than just kind of sit back and police the game state in Commander, I'm not using my removal spells against my opponents like that. I'm going to add to the board consistently with every single threat, giving them must-answer cards. In fact, I have a category of must-answer spells. For example, here we get to must-answer. All of these cards on their own just feed the engine so much more that my opponents have to deal with them, as opposed to dealing with Kaikar. Now, I do have other token makers in here, so Kaikar is not the crux of the deck, but rather just one of the engine pieces. But if I get out a Caretaker's Talent, I'm drawing cards when I make my tokens, and then I buff them up really high. Impact Tremors, Molten Gatekeeper, and Witty Roastmaster burn my opponents as I make more and more tokens, cantripping through my deck. Arabella will burn for the number of tokens I have, while Elspeth can both double the amount of tokens I make, and also pump them all up and give them evasion. Ohertak is a 3x multiplier, which is bad enough as it is. And then Horn of Valhalla can give +10/+10 to one of my creatures that has flying, allowing me to snipe out opponents who don't have the proper blockers, or use the removal spells in their hand against me. I have Invasion of Gobakon as a way to take something out of my opponent's hand and then grow my board continuously once I flip the battle and win. And Jeskai Ascendancy to keep pumping up my creatures and letting me filter through my deck. Finally, two actual finishing spells. I have Moonshaker Cavalry to give everything +X/+X, similar to Craterhoof Behemoth, in order to just finish out the game. And Starlight Spectacular, which was printed in Unfinity, so I know a lot of people aren't a huge fan of that set, but oh my god. This is effectively a Cathar's Crusade, but rather than 1/1 counters, it just goes through your creatures at the beginning of each combat. So you don't look like a threat on your opponent's turns, but as soon as it's your combat step, you're knocking someone out of the game. I like this card a lot. My opponents often won't recognize what it is if I cast its second main phase until my next turn if I can survive, but usually I'll hold it in hand and just take someone out with me. The point is, I could, as we go through some ramp and then removal and protection, I do have removal spells in this deck. I've got Case of the Gateway Express, I have Role Reversal's fun, Swords to Plowshares, Generous Gift, Wear and Tear. I have a couple of board wipes in like Final Showdown, and there is an Elspeth Sun's Champion. However, the majority of these quote-unquote removal spells are more so protection spells. Final Showdown can also give something indestructible. Arcane Denial, Counterspell, Protect the Negotiators, Stink into Stupor, Negate. All of these cards can also be used in a protective way in order to hold my board together, Clever Concealment, and stop my opponents from being able to remove my threats. And by consistently playing threats that need to be removed, I'm playing this high resource game where my opponents are using their resources both to take me out as much as possible, and I'm using mine to just continue adding to the board, as so many of these cards also benefit me in how they add. Case of the Gateway Express eventually becomes an Anthem. We have Jeskai Charm is removal spell, but it can also pump all my creatures if I need to. I'm constantly providing another threat with my removal spells, as well as my cards in general are built to keep adding pressure to my opponents. And in the number 1 slot, we have Make Them Have It. Thank you to the user @ShownMatthew for suggesting this on the last video and giving your interpretation of it in the comments. When is it correct to play around a trick that you think your opponent might have or that might completely ruin your game versus take the leap? Are you with me now? It's contextual. It depends. This is a classic lawyer answer, by the way. If you ever talk to a lawyer, they will give this to you continuously. It depends. That is always the situation. After all, there's a few different ways that this can be played. It is almost always correct to play around a trick. Make Them Have It is not technically correct in the way that it's phrased. It's most often used as one of 2 ways. As Shown Matthew put it in the comments, they often use this when they want to bait their opponent into reacting incorrectly. They'll say, make them have it in a game before they swing out or cast what looks like a big spell, hoping that their opponent will incorrectly remove one of the creatures on board or counterspell the spell that they're currently casting so that they can follow it up with a better play. As I mentioned earlier, this plays on the whole bluffing element and poker element that comes with Magic, where you're playing against your opponent and you can trick them into misreading how you play the game so they think that you have different cards in your hand than you might actually have. My personal opinion of this is when you're on the back foot. You need this to work. Your back is up against the wall. Make Them Have It is correct when you don't really have an option. You need to make riskier and riskier plays because you are falling further and further behind on resources. After all, if your opponent has all their mana up, 3 cards in hand, you have no clue what they've got, but you're at this point completely out of gas. There's no cards, you do have a board state, and you can potentially attack for lethal, but they might attack you back on the crackback. Well, you don't really have any options. In this particular game state, you're not drawing any more cards. If your blocks aren't particularly good or you just have these small evasive creatures, you can't survive through a gummed up board to draw more cards. At the end of the day, you got to make them have it. You're going to either lose over the next few turns as your opponent has 3 cards and deploys their resources, or you're going to lose right here and right now when they kill one of your blockers on the next turn and attacks you in anyway. So at that point, you might as well just go for the attack. If they have it, it's the beats. That's what happens. They killed one of your attackers and now they'll be able to attack you for lethal on their next turn. But if they don't have it, you win the game. Your flyers get in. You don't give them a chance to draw the removal spell. You don't give them a chance to then deploy their big creature that has reach to then stop you from winning on the next turn. Make Them Have It, from my perspective, is most often correct when you have to make a risk calculation about whether or not this is the appropriate move to make, whether it's not worth playing around the trick, when it's worth going for the kill. And the way that you might get punished for doing that, either that's it, you don't have any other options, or in certain other situations when it might be worth it. You might have a really good attack set up. Sure, they might have mana up, but if you've got a great attack, at a certain point, it might just be worth going for it and seeing what spell they cast in response. After all, it's okay if you lose the combat. It's okay if you block with your if you block their 3/3 with your 4/4, and then they cast some kind of combat trick to win the combat. Because at the end of the day, losing a combat doesn't matter if you win the game. At a certain point, and Jim Davis does a great video of this, God, this was from a year ago, I think, where he talks about it's okay to throw a combat or to fall for certain tricks because it makes your opponent feel smart. It makes your opponent feel like they're ahead on board. It rewards them for holding up the mana to use their tricks, because then on a later combat, when they need those tricks to survive or to push through that final point of damage, they no longer have them. You're not playing for the battle, you're playing for the full game. You need to make them have it. There are so many of these Magic sayings, idioms, etc. Math is for blockers, reading the card explains the card, and that creature is a kill on sight. There are also some incredibly intelligent individuals who have written entire articles on some of these concepts. As I mentioned earlier in the video, Jim Davis. There's also, most notably, Mike Flores in his famous article, Who's the Beatdown? Let me know if you want me to cover any of these sayings or principles much more in depth, or walk through some of the articles and show contextually how they work in modern day Magic, and where they might even need some additional help. Or that's all the time we have. After all, there are more games to play, more strategy to analyze, and unfortunately, more work to do. I'm Supreme Verdicts. Have a wonderful rest of your day.